what are the classes, data members, methods, messages, data encapsulation concept, data abstraction, and the information hiding. Then inheritance, polymorphism. Benefits of OOP as well as C++ as a we are going to learn object oriented programming language. In the next part, we are going to look for the C++ programming concept. Then C++ programming basics, we are going to see data types, structures, enumerations, control structures, arrays and strings, class, object, class and data abstraction, how to access specifiers, and separating interfaces from the implementation. This we are going to focus in the second part, and the last part of this unit, functions. Function, function prototype, accessing function and utility function, constructors and the destructor concept, types of constructor, then the object and memory requirements, static members, variable and functions, as well as inline function and the friend function concepts. Okay, so this is the how our organization of the unit 1 is. In this view we are going to focus. Okay, so first we see what do you mean by the programming languages. Programming languages allow the programmer to code the software. Whatever the software in real life, day to day life we use, this is how we can do or how we can write in terms of this programming language. So, there are the three types of languages. First is the machine language, second is the assembly language, third is the high level languages. So we can say that we know machine language is very closer to the machine, right? So, but for the human being, machine language is we cannot deal with the machine language as a human being. For that, actually, whatever the comprises of programming, it is being done with the help of ones and zeros. Only ones and zeros. That is a binary language, also we can say. Okay, but this is very difficult for the human being to write down the code in the terms of the ones and zeros, right? So for that, the computer it is very easy and it will do it fast, as we are providing it in terms of ones and zeros, so computer can understand it very well. Okay, so example of that code is given in this, like that the binary code is obtained for that machine language and it will be instructed to the machine. So we'll get the output accordingly. Then after machine language, then comes assembly languages. Assembly languages are again somewhat closer to the machine language, and we can say it is an interface between the machine language and the interface between the towards the high level language. Okay, so it is in the middle. Okay, assembly languages step toward the easier programming, so we can accept that the assembly language is somewhat easier than the machine language. Assembly languages are comprised of a set of element commands, like we can say that commands are the mnemonics. But before knowing that mnemonic, we must know what is the processor, what is the architecture behind that. So process, unless and until you know the processor, what is the IBM processor or the Mac processor, accordingly that processor architecture we should know as a when we are dealing with assembly language. So somewhat it is again difficult. Behind that architecture you have to know what are the different instruction sets, and accordingly we can program using that commands, and we can say that mnemonics we use for the operation purpose. So different operations are done with the help of that mnemonics and instruction. So for example, add instruction is given, but the we have given the operands as well. So in example, it is like add and the operands. But before going for the operands also, we must know what are the different registers of that instruction set. Suppose add instruction is there and we are going to add the register contents, like instruction becomes add R1 comma R2 if the registers are represented by R1 and R2. Likewise, assembly language is there. But for assembly language also, we have to use assembler. That is what assembler is, the intermediate or that converts into the assembly language into the machine language. So for the assembly language, we require the assembler, which is nothing but a converter, language converter, which converts the language of assembly language into the machine language. That converts the language of the assembly language into the machine language, right? So this is what our second assembly language. So likewise, there are more instructions. For that, we should know the instruction set of the assembly language. It is again difficult job for the programmer to know the architecture behind that or to know the different instruction sets. So this is again closer, we can say, if somebody knows the architecture, then it is easier task for that person. Then our next comes our high level language. Okay, so high level languages comes to make the language or the representation easier task for the human being. Okay, so high level languages represent a very giant leap towards the easier programming. One can code a high level language using or without knowing the behind architecture of that computer. Okay, so whatever the architecture, it might be not understandable by that person, but he can code the language. So the syntax of high level language is similar to the English language or English sentence, English statement. So historically, we can divide the high level languages again into the two groups. As they came towards the existence, we can divide it into two groups. One is the procedural languages, and another is the object oriented languages. Okay, so as we know that first the procedural languages came and then the object oriented languages came. Right. So what do you mean by procedural languages? Early high level languages are typically called procedural languages. Means high level languages, they are called as procedural languages. Procedural languages are characterized by the sequential sets of linear commands. Okay, so linear commands is one after the another commands are executed. The focus of such language is on the structure. How is the structure of the programming language? This is the main important concept for procedural language. So for that, the different examples which includes C language, COBOL language, then Fortran, Lisp, then the Perl language, HTML, VB scripts. This all the languages comes into the category of procedural languages. This came early in 1970s durations. Okay, so initially started with the C language. Basically, the C language became very popular at that time. Right? This is a one of the very good language as it come out with the procedural language. And apart from that, there are the certain languages which has to be used for the basically different purposes. So we have that COBOL, Fortran, Lisp, and Perl languages at the same time. And then for the web language, we come for HTML and VB script. Then came with the different OOP languages. Okay, so OOP languages comes afterward. that most object oriented languages are high level languages, most object oriented or OOPS languages. The focus of OOP languages is not on the structure, but now the focus is changed accordingly to modeling the data. Okay, so firstly, the focus was only for the structure which is made from start to bottom. Okay, so for the now for UPRA language, the structure has been meant for the modeling or the whole and soul. The data is important, how to data to be accessed. Programmers code using the blueprints of the data models, which are called as classes. Now programmer have to know the whatever the classes concept and the how the classes are making or using the data. For example of OOP languages include the C++ language, Visual Basic .NET, and the Java language. Okay, these are the very much popular languages. C++ was the very essential language. If we come across the OOP concept, then the first language, which is a combination of the C language combination plus the Simula 67. The language name is Simula 67. This is the combination of the earlier C language and the OOP features which comes from the Simula 67 language. Now these two languages comes together to get the C++ language. Earlierly that language is called as C with classes. So earlier name for this is C plus classes. Okay, then come out with the name C++, or we can say it is the uh, superset of the C language, C++. So we are going to have the detail of C++ later on. Right now we are having that started with the object oriented languages, and we come across what are the object oriented languages. For example, started with the C++, right? Now what is the OOP paradigm? What is the OOP paradigm? OOP or the object oriented programming is a programming paradigm based on the concept of objects which can contain the data in the form of fields, often known as its attributes or the properties, and the code in the form of procedures, and it is often known as the methods or the functions. That means OOP is a programming where the concept is based on the object, and these objects are the real time entities. Okay, so which contains the data as well as which contains the code which can handle this data, which contains the code which is called as the methods or the functions which will handle this data which is inside this class. Okay, inside this whole concept of the object oriented programming paradigm, it is based on the concept of objects only. Everything in OOP is the object, everything. Okay, so now when we focus on the or the why this is the procedure oriented programming, in procedure oriented programming emphasis is on doing the things, that is the algorithm, start algorithm, and the many times large programs are divided into the smaller programs known as the functions, small functions. Okay, so it is like modular programming is done there. So different modules are connected with the small functions and small programs, and then they divided into or they are formed a large program. So most of the functions share in that case the global data, because every function small program requires the data which is coming from the another program. So what happened in the procedure oriented programming language, the data or whatever the variables that mentioned to be a global variables or global data is main focus. And because the global data was the main focus, there is no security. There is no security. So data move openly around the system from function to function. Data was moving just openly around the whole system from one function to another function. So in that case, there is no chance of the securing that data because it is just freely, openly moving from one function to another function. Functions transform from one form to another form. Functions can transform from one form to another form. Likewise, we have employs top-down approach in program design. That means it employs the topmost to reaching from top to bottom approach in the program design. Okay, so this what is the procedure oriented programming model, which is the our data is not very much secure in this kind of programming. Okay, so you can look here one procedure oriented programming, how the global data is accessed by the different functions. Functions are segregated by the name, function 1, function 2, function, and all these functions, actually this is the function 3. Okay, so namely they have their local data as they are having the functions definitions differently, but actually they are accessing the global data. So one function can change that global data, can be accessed by the another function. So global data is actually it is defined outside the any functions. So every function can access that global data. So this is what the relationship of the data and the functions in the procedure oriented programming. Likewise, we have this already mentioned. I have mentioned that procedure oriented programming, the data is not secured, it is accessible by the every function. It is accessible by every function. So what are the different limitations of the procedural programming languages? What are the different limitations? This can be listed out like the program code is harder to write. Then, somewhat if you see the programming is harder, then the procedural code is often not reusable. Whatever the code written that is mentioned for that function, it is not reusable for that other procedural code, which may pose the need to recreate the code same again and again, repeating the code if it is needed for to use to another application. So that is what the limitation. Similarly, it is difficult to relate with the real world object, and it is difficult to relate with the real world object also, which is the need of the our day to day life. We can have the real world object and emphasis is given to the real world objects to gather together and then write a code for that. So this is difficult with the help of the procedural programming. Next is the importance is given to the operation rather than the data, which might pose the issues in some data sensitive cases. Now, in case whenever we want the data to be secured, data to be hidden, this is not possible with the case of the procedural programming, because there are the different modules and that different modules wants to access the same data and that data has to be changed by some of the module. Okay, so the that is the again the problem. Next problem is the data is exposed to the whole program, making it not so much security as a friendly of the nature. So these are all the limitations of procedural programming languages. So what is then the benefits of the OOP programming? Then OOP mimics the real world. That is what it whatever the our real world entities. It is making use of that real world entities to make it understand by the OOP concept, and it will just frame out, encapsulate out the real world examples into the programming. Then OOP codes are reusable in other programs as well. Once a OOP code is written, it can be, or whatever the class is written, it can be reusable in other program. That is, the reusability is there. Then the security offered due to the use of the data hiding and the data abstraction mechanism. So one more feature is added in the OOP type of languages, security. Security is this is a issue which was not with the OOP procedural languages. So it is added here for the OOP based languages. So the features like data hiding and the abstraction mechanism can be used for the security purpose. Similarly, we have the next thing, that is the modularity and the encapsulation based, which makes the ease of the management. So all these features or the benefits makes the OOP language, it is famous than the, or we can say useful than the earlier procedural languages. Okay, so likewise we move ahead to the how is the OOP paradigm is there. OOP paradigm is like how this is the communication done with the data and functions, or the organization of the data and functions in OOP is done. So we can see here we have object A, object B, and object C. In that we can see it is encapsulated into the data and functions. So data and functions for the object A, data and functions for object B, data and functions for the object C. All this can be communicated between through the each other object through only functions. So we cannot directly use the data of object A or object B or object C. This has to be used via functions or the methods of that particular class. So OOP paradigm is explained in this figure as the data and functions in OOP, how this can be communicated